at about 22, so I think I'll get going and hope that people are able to join us. Welcome everyone to this webinar as part of the gLOCAL platform. And this particular webinar is called Being the Change Towards Greater Inclusion and Diversity in International Development Evaluation. My name is Ramya Subrahmanian, and I am speaking to you from the UNICEF Office of Research Innocenti, now known as the Global Office of Research and Foresight, based in Florence, Italy. And it is my pleasure today to moderate this 90-minute webinar. We have a great lineup of speakers, but just a little bit of housekeeping before we start. And one is that we are in the 90 minutes, we have 4 speakers, and we will be dividing this into 2 parts with a little space for Q&A in between. We know it's very difficult when you're a virtual webinar for everyone to have a say, but we will request you to please introduce yourselves to each other, maybe in the chat if you feel like it. And also, if you have any questions as the presentations go on, feel free to put them in the chat, maybe tag whoever it is your question is aimed at, and we'll do our best to get to them. But I'm hoping this is a start of a conversation where, as the gLOCAL week goes on and the webinars happen, these conversations are being moved from one webinar to another. And of course, our colleagues, our speakers will also speak to the issues as we go along. So just by way of context, as many of you know, when you registered, we are interested in this webinar in looking at evaluation as an ecosystem and as a very kind of powerful machine within international affairs. We know that evaluation and assessments of aid effectiveness may and often determines what gets funded, who gets funded, what gets shut down. There's a lot of power associated with that decision making, which often a good quality, we hope, evaluations can influence for the better, but sometimes that's not also always the case. What gets picked up, what doesn't, is also an issue of discretion very often, of decision making that often happens behind closed doors. And so we know that even within the United Nations system alone, there are hundreds of evaluation reports being produced. At Innocenti, we spend a lot of our time looking at evaluation reports to glean lessons. How do we learn from evaluations to influence programming? But so much of that also is about how are we defining, who gets to define, how we design, and what methodologies we develop, and so on. So there's a lot of political and power-based decision-making that takes place often within the evaluation ecosystem. And this webinar is going to take us towards some of those conversations we should be having about calling out those power dynamics and seeing how better we address and do evaluations better in a more inclusive and equitable way. And so this machine, I know we will have a speaker speaking to this, that there is an industry almost that conducts evaluations, and are we living up to values that we share as a global community? Are evaluation processes and results in line with the intentions, for example, of our global commitments, the UN Charter, core international human rights instruments, SDGs, and also the global commitment to leave no one behind. And what do we mean when we say we want to work towards an equitable future for people and planet? How do we look at some of these questions in a more dynamic way? So this webinar will be really talking about development evaluation as an inherently political process influenced by power relations, but also talk about ways in which we can reverse in the way we design and deliver these evaluations. So lots of questions and a great panel today to help us think about these questions from different perspectives. I'd like to start by introducing Cecilia Milesi, who is the founder of Global Change Center, a South-South platform raising Global South voices with the aim to catalyze change processes. She is from Argentina, a sociologist specializing in violence, conflict, and inclusive development. And she's also a senior advisor at the Decolonizing Research Partnerships for the Global Affairs think tank ODI. Our second speaker we will turn to is Dr. Tordjman-Nebe, who is a senior evaluation specialist in the corporate and thematic evaluation section of UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office in New York. And one of the things to highlight about Tina and that she will speak to is she also recently coordinated the UN Evaluation Group work streams on methods and ethics, co-authoring the UNEG UN Evaluation Group's ethical guidelines. So welcome to Cecilia and Tina. They will be speaking in the first sort of segment of our webinar. And then Pradeep and Tarini will follow. Tarini is Tarini Shipurkar is a senior program officer with Praxis Institute for Participatory Practices in New Delhi, India. And she's also a sociologist with a keen interest in gender, youth, and human rights. And at Praxis, she's done a lot of work aimed at supporting denotified and nomadic tribes in India, conducting community research, fellowships, etc. So a lot of rich experience there. And she will be followed by Pradeep Narayanan, who is her colleague at Praxis, and he's an advisor and an expert practitioner, if you like, of participatory methods and approaches across multiple programs in the Global South, and a rights-based researcher associated with many NGOs and campaigns across India. And one of the things about Pradeep, that there's a long bio on the web, but to know is that both of them will be speaking to very innovative and exciting work coming out of Praxis, to look at how we reverse some of these inequities that are so structural within the evaluation ecosystem. So without much ado, and a welcome to all our panelists, but also again, a repeat welcome to those of you who have just joined us. We're very excited to start this conversation. As I said, to those of you who've joined late, we will be working, it's a very tight timeline, but we will do this in 2 segments, and you are very welcome to put any questions, especially if they're targeted to specific speakers, in the chat, but please also use the chat to introduce yourselves to each other. And let's get started. So I'm going to be the timekeeper as well, and I hope I'm not too distracted by these amazing presentations. We will start with Cecilia, who will lay the ground for us thinking about the operation of power dynamics in evaluations. So Cecilia, you have about 15 minutes or less to start your presentation. And in advance, my thanks to Saisha and Vijay, who are helping move the slides along. We have one consolidated slide deck to save time. So over to everybody to get the ball rolling. So Cecilia, please, your time starts now.
Thank you, Ramya. Hello, everyone. It's really amazing to be here with you. I hope we have an excellent exchange. I'm very proud to present our landscape analysis on equity-oriented evaluation, which was commissioned by the Ford Foundation, by the Global Strategy and Learning team in New York. And I'm very happy to be here with Praxis, which is our main partner from the Global South, that also co-designed, co-evolved, and now is working with Global Change Center and our 8 Global South partners in disseminating the findings and the knowledge. So these findings do not stay with us or in our lost report, but really reaches as many organizations, multilateral, bilateral, donors, organizations, grassroots, social movement as possible, and we mobilize and catalyze change, as Ramya was saying, that is the main mission of Global Change Center. I think also Kelsey and Bess from Ford Foundation are here with us, so I hope maybe they want to add anything at the end of this presentation. We were very proud to be selected by the Ford Foundation as a consortium, as a collective of Global South organizations, and we were very happy that the Ford Foundation really trusted our collective. We never worked before with the Ford Foundation, and we purposely decided that in order to unpack what it means to embed equity in the international cooperation ecosystem, and specifically in the evaluation, it was a very important decision to do this with Global South organizations that are normally the victims or the subjects and objects of evaluation, rather than the agent of evaluations or the leaders of the evaluation processes and initiatives. So we took the decision to create this consortium, this collective, with 2 organizations from Latin America, 2 organizations from Asia, and 2 organizations from Africa. And we continue working today, even though we have already finished with the report, because we believe that it's important to engage in dissemination of this knowledge and eventually do our little contribution to affect change. So it's also amazing to be working close to the UN at the moment in pressing for this transformation to center equity in the evaluation landscape. So you can access the full report in our website, and I'm going to, or maybe also Tarini can help me to paste it in the chat. In the website, in the report, of course, you will find all the conclusions. I will not be able to present everything in 10 or 15 minutes, but I invite you that you visit our websites to download the reports and share it with your networks and your community. So basically, after conducting more than 100 interviews, all done, as I just said, by our Global South partners in the 3 regions of the Global South, but also engaging with the donors in the bilateral, we interview the UN, we interview bilateral organizations, including USAID, we interview philanthropic organizations. We reach and after analyzing also at the South-South level, a lot of data and information, asking the question, what is happening that evaluations are not really embedding equity or justice and dignity as we move along. We reached to a conclusion that maybe will not surprise to any of you that have been working in the evaluation ecosystem for a while. We reached to these very simple conclusions that the way that evaluations are commissioned, the way that evaluations are designed, the way that evaluations are funded, implemented, and disseminated, they are basically perpetuating structural inequities and historical inequities at the global, regional, national, and local level. So instead of being used as an intervention or being implemented as an opportunity to promote emancipatory learning, to promote really transformative change, because the way that they are done and the way that this is happening throughout the whole evaluation cycle, they are basically becoming, or they are a tool, another tool of oppression in the international cooperation system. As Ramya said, evaluations are used to make very important decisions in regards to the continuation of a program, to how much money is invested in one place or the other, how much money is not invested in another place or the other, and this is directly affecting people's life. However, because the way, as I was saying, the evaluation is done, this is basically just created a situation of big, deep unfairness and injustice that is directly suffered and felt in particular by the so-called objects of the evaluation that are the most marginalized peoples in the Global South. So they are in a way, when they enter into the programming cycle of philanthropies or donors or bilateral organizations, they are re-victimized when they are also invited to become part of these evaluations that eventually, again, put them in a position of powerless and unfairness. So in our landscape analysis and through doing these South-South joint analysis, interviews, and focus groups, we wanted and we said before that it was very important to look at the power dynamics and to unpack more clearly how unfair power dynamics were affecting the evaluation ecosystem, and to unpack this with Global South lenses, as I was saying, with the perspective and understanding the experiences of the Global South as a collective and partners, but also with the people that we interview. And we propose something that you will find more explained in detail in the report, to unpack how inequity is reinforced and injustice is reinforced, or otherwise equity could be enforced or promoted by looking at different dimensions of what we call in the report and in our learning framework and our research framework, the spectrum of equity. We basically said that if any donor or any organization, any group, collective promoting dignity, justice, and human rights, if they want to understand if they are promoting equity or not throughout the evaluation process, we need to look at these dimensions that are presented and summarized in this slide. First of all, we need to look at who is funding the evaluation and how that particular power holder is setting up criteria, standards, or making decisions as to how the evaluation is done, who is recruited, what are the methods, and we need to be monitoring and working closely with that particular power holder to help or to support to transform the way that donor working in collaboration with the evaluation colleagues decide what are the principles guiding the evaluations. So a second dimension that is necessary to look if we are going to explore if evaluation is supporting or not equity is what are the guiding principles. Is the evaluation more oriented only towards measuring, for example, value for money, efficiency, and effectiveness, or is really looking at how different participants, citizens have been involved in the evaluation processes and have a voice through participatory methods, through inclusive methods, not only during the evaluation process, but also throughout the programming process? Is it going to be guided by principles of human rights and justice, and making sure, as Tina will present later, that an ethical approach is guiding the evaluation, or is just really counting certain outputs against money? Another dimension that we mention in the report, and we kind of conclude that is necessary to be looking at if we want to deconstruct and understand if evaluations are promoting equity or otherwise, is looking at how partnerships are established in order to develop evaluation. Are these partnerships only with Global South, a Global North evaluator, or Global North consultancies? Are they basically about, entering into the local ecosystems without understanding the context, the language, the cultural, the political dynamics? So really looking at the partnership for evaluation and from learning, it's also something really important if we want to address issues of top-down approach, almost invasion of others' spaces and territories and culture through partnerships that are not really linked with the local needs and demands. Of course, two other dimensions that are extremely important to be unpacking is what are the methods and the approaches that are being used in order to implement the evaluation. In particular, in regards to the methods, we see a tendency normally to look at quantitative methods that assumptions are very linear rather than looking at systems, dynamics, or interconnections. And finally, we need to look at the issues of purpose, how the evaluation findings and lessons are then used for what particular goal. Is for the goal of really transforming the realities that and the suffering of people on the ground, or is basically about continuing with a situation of control and upward accountability to sustain certain organizations, certain funding mechanisms, certain people that are more privileged than others in control of the international cooperation and the evaluation ecosystem. So when you go into the report, you will see how we've basically unpacked these different dimensions. And you will see also that after we have described from the findings and from the stories that we heard across the globe from more than 100 people that we interview, something very, very also perhaps obvious for many of you that are here, that basically those that are excluded by the evaluation or the way that the evaluation industry works are people from the Global South. Not only when people from the Global South are hired or are invited to develop evaluation in partnership with Global North donors, most of them are sometimes part of a elite that doesn't necessarily understand local cultures in a given context, or even local indigenous language, or understand ways of producing knowledge and ways of promoting change and policy making in the diverse regions of their own country or continent. So this alliance between global North elites and global South elites is something that constantly as well maintains certain people silenced and invisibilized. So what we kind of unpack is an issue of systemic exclusion that have to be deeply assessed when any particular donor or bilateral or multilateral agency decides about doing evaluation. And obviously, in that particular context, what we are proposing is a situation in which there are truly effort to create learning partnerships with organizations that are very much close to those that are directly affected by any particular situation of inequity, poverty, conflict, etc.
Cecilia, just less than 2 minutes now, please. Sorry, I was trying to find a moment.
Sure, thank you, Ramya. So this systemic exclusion happens, and you will also find these details in the report because how the system operates at different levels. We particularly establish or kind of organize our own thinking of how these barriers are put into or are kind of crafted into the system to permeate inequity throughout the whole process at the policy, at the organizational, and at the methodological and at the dissemination level. So what we are basically proposing in our report, in the journeys of change, and as you will see as well, the efforts at the UN level or the efforts of some philanthropists like Ford and others are trying is to look at very closely at how the policies, standards, and criteria that they have crafted for their own organizations are or not promoting equity and reaching out to the most oppressed and marginalized. The second dimension is looking at the organizational barriers. You will see that we describe things how, for example, how terms of reference are put together, the recruitment practices that lack everything in terms of really partnering with the organizations that are closer to the most marginalized. The purpose that the donors has and the way that they look at how the mission of the evaluations is also that something have to be unpacked if a donor wants to transform their ways of working. In terms of methodology, as I mentioned, there are certain methods that basically utilize the most marginalized and excluded people for quantitative purposes, for scientific purposes that are basically extractive and that become a tool of oppression. So we kind of explain what are these methods and how other methods could be used in the evaluations in order to promote equity. And finally, dissemination.
Sorry. Okay, last point because you're over a minute already. Thank you.
Definitely. So finally, dissemination, which is basically ensuring that evaluations become a tool for transformation, for sharing knowledge, for transforming the reality at the local community level. Of course, if the changes at the policy, organizational, methodological level, even if we do dissemination, it's not enough to transform these institutional wide barriers. I'm not going to take longer. I'm sorry, I normally speak too much, but just finally invite you to read the full report where the journeys of change are described, and you will now listen to some of them, including the work that the UN is doing and that the Praxis Institute of Participatory Practices is doing in Asia and India. Thank you so much. I'm happy to respond to any question after.
Thank you, Cecilia. And I always hate being the one having to stop people from speaking, and so fascinating, but I know we will make this available, and I don't know how, and we'll make the PowerPoints available in some way, but thank you. And over therefore directly to Tina, because I think Cecilia has already created the bridge for you. So over to you, and you have 10 minutes, and I will unfortunately also be keeping time for you. Over to you, Tina.
Thank you, Ramya. Hello, everyone. So As Ramya said when introducing me, I'm speaking today on behalf of the UN Evaluation Group's working group on ethics, as well as my own office, the Independent Evaluation Office of UNDP. And I think I'm speaking from a position of a kind of ally of what Cecilia was talking about. So from a position of power, but from a position of a group of people that are very sympathetic to this agenda and that want to be agents of change from within. So today, I'm going to give you an example of how in an evaluation we tackled the theme of equity, but also specifically on the process. So I will talk a lot about the things that went wrong, some of the things that went well, but there's still a lot of path to do on the journey to actually live up to the agenda. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the starting point for this is the UNEC ethical guidelines for evaluation. And this is a document that I was a co-author of with 3 other UN colleagues in 2020. And it's based on 4 core principles: integrity, accountability, respect, and beneficence. And this guidelines now is being rolled out, or has been rolled out, across the UN evaluation offices, of which there are some 48 or so. And it also includes a pledge of conduct, which evaluators in-house and external evaluators sign when they get involved in our projects. Next slide, please. So here you see the pledge, and you can see the 4 principles. So it's about being honest and truthful, professional, independent, of course, that's an important one, about being transparent regarding the evaluation, responsive and responsible, allowing everyone to access the evaluation process, all relevant stakeholders, and ensuring meaningful participation, fair representation of voices. And then beneficence is kind of the new kid on the block, the more difficult to understand, but the most important principle perhaps, which really says that we want to strive to be a force for good and counter what Cecilia has just explained to us, and actually stop perpetuating harmful power relations and instead weigh the risks and benefits of conducting evaluations. And if we see that we're doing harm, we stop. Next slide, please. So all of this is very hard actually to put into practice when you sit in a corporate evaluation office in the UN. Here are some of the parameters that guide my own work at UNDP's Independent Evaluation Office. So first of all, the evaluations I conduct are corporate and thematic evaluations. So they pick a broad theme, like recently we had access to justice, working with the private sector, biodiversity. So broad themes like this, that we look at from a global perspective. So across the board of what UNDP does, and including institutional effectiveness. And the time frame are about 9 months, and we conduct them in-house with consultant support. So I would be, or my colleagues in the IO would be the ones actually authoring the reports. And the recommendations that we make only go to UNDP management. They don't go to partners. So there's quite a lot of emphasis on the institutional issues along with the programmatic issues as well. Budget is about 200,000 typically, and that would go for consultancy support, travel, and kind of any software we need, as well as external reviews to ensure the quality. Next slide, please. So here is the example from the Leave No One Behind evaluation that I conducted in 2022. The evaluation was formative, which was really nice. It allowed it to be much more engaging and participatory than what sometimes happens with those global thematic evaluations. And it was based on a 5-factor framework, which is really helpful to understand intersectionality there at the middle of those 5 factors that overlap. to actually include and discriminate people. So you see geography, socioeconomic status, governance, vulnerability to shocks, and discrimination based on people's ascribed identities overlap. And so in this evaluation, we were trying to understand in how far UNDP had been successful in integrating the Leave No One Behind principle into its operations, so both program and institution. And that included human resources, that included procurement, that included a lot of internal issues along with the 6 key programmatic areas that UNDP works on. And the mandate to do this had come from the SDG agenda, of course, where Leave No One Behind is one of the principles of the 2030 agenda given to the UN system and the development system on the whole. Next, please. So here are a couple of findings, but I don't really want to go into those. I'll leave them on the slides for you to check out at a later stage. Please, next slide. What I really want to talk about is the ethics of conducting this evaluation and what I think worked and where we're still really, really grappling. So in terms of, this is organized by the 4 principles, right, that I just exposed on the UN Evaluation Group's ethical guidelines. So the first one, integrity. So in terms of independence, an office like mine is well placed because the office itself is structurally independent. So that means we can write pretty much what we want, and it doesn't need to go through any of the corporate, systems that could edit out or censor any of the things we want to say. However, the behavioral independence of the individuals working on this piece still needs to be ensured, and this is about making the right hiring choices. And I think together with wanting a diverse team, we want impartial people working on this kind of work. So diversity, I put it in red here. We managed to get people from all continents. We managed to get men and women, but there were some issues. For instance, I had proposed a blind lady to be on the advisory panel for this evaluation. And our directorate did not accept this for 2 reasons. One, they said it could be perceived as tokenistic. And second, they also said that there may not be accommodations for this person to effectively read the report and comment on the report. So you can see, even on a topic like Leave No One Behind, still some way to go.
Tina, you have just under 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. What worked well was training all the team members on the ethical requirements. So using the ethical guidelines, having a conversation about what this means in context. And we had national data collectors in 5 countries that could speak the languages, that could engage with local communities, which were the most left behind in those countries, right? Either geographically or because of certain characteristics. So that worked out well. And I think there was, from all of us, a commitment on reflexive practice and to understand really the reality of what happened on the ground. In terms of accountability, feeding information back to people who engaged in the evaluation process was really important. And I was a little bit shocked to see my own colleagues from the country offices that we worked with to be so surprised to hear back from us after evaluation. But they said, oh, we never hear back from the central, evaluation office. Typically, our information is extracted and then it shows up in some report somewhere on a website. Whereas here, the effort we made was to feedback the board decision to the country offices to say how their information had been used. And there was a lot of appreciation for that. In terms of feeding back to communities that had participated in focus groups and so forth, there is still a lot to be done. We tried it via posters. So we had a poster translated into local languages and distributed to some NGOs. It didn't work out in all of the countries. It only worked in some of the countries. for stupid reasons like not having a budget and, or no longer working with this NGO that hosted the focus group. But anyway, an attempt was made, but it was very, very incomplete. And also it was very hard for us actually to translate the recommendations which were geared at UNDP management into a language that would be meaningful to people in communities. On respect, an important element was going through an external ethical review board and integrating safeguards into our protocols. So this was important, for instance, when speaking with survivors of violence or other persons that were really had harmful experiences, to make sure that if any trauma was relived during the interview process, that there would be help on site. A clarity of language turned out to be quite difficult. Just in itself, this concept of leave no one behind really didn't translate well into all local languages, and it seemed very abstract and hard to understand. On beneficence, doing good for people and planet, I think on the planet part, we were being helped by, ironically, by COVID-19, because none of the international team traveled. So we had the opportunity actually to work very strongly through local evaluators that knew much better what they were doing on the ground and could actually understand. And we also didn't have emissions in that sense. The doing no harm in terms of actually being willing to stop an evaluation when we get in harm's way. I think there is an institutional disincentive built into the way we do our work, which is that consultants are paid on deliverable. So if you collect data and you have to stop because it's unethical, it becomes unethical for one or another reason, you wouldn't be paid. So there is a huge disincentive to actually stop.
You're kind of well over time, Tina. So if you could wrap up, please.
Yeah, that was. I'm actually done. I just want to leave you with the final thought that these 6 recommendations went to UNDP's executive board, and specifically the recommendation to engage more strongly with civil society on leaving no one behind, because civil society is much closer to the most marginalized populations on the ground. And the recommendation to work more strongly on non-discrimination were very, very much discussed in UNDP's executive board, and we have seen some changes resulting from this over the last year or so. With that, back to you, Ramya, and many thanks.
Great, thank you, Cecilia and Tina. I think you've kind of wrapped up this sort of very interesting first segment, which is really about how we start thinking and working differently when we think about evaluation from that kind of political perspective, and we look at how, and I like your sort of 6 elements, Cecilia, which really allow us to think very critically about different elements of how we go about designing an evaluation or even thinking about it. And I'm always very struck by how evaluation has now become a word that is, people actually don't like it. They don't feel comfortable with it because it always implies that someone's going to come and tell you what you've done wrong, rather than actually being about respecting and learning about people's work. And I know how much we struggle when we try and look at phenomena and try to understand how different phenomena like child labor or child marriage, how they play out. How do you design an evaluation for phenomena that doesn't fit neat categories, and who's determining those categories, right? And then what we found when we go and look at the people who are doing incredible work on the ground is because their work doesn't fit neat categories, we often miss it because they're responding in a very dynamic way. And we go in with these models, which are very, very sort of, static and so on. And there's something to be done there. I don't think the evaluators are going in with a bad intention, but, methodology meets reality, and somehow we need to be much more, open-ended and inclusive about how we even think about that. So I think you've given us a lot of food for thought. I have a question here from Sanyukta, who says, this is to Tina, and I may maybe just take one question since I don't see more. which is this question about disincentives, Tina, that it says, she says, thank you. Any recommendations for how to get around that and how the executive board engaged with that one in particular, the question of disincentives. And they'd have to the ability to change that payment policy to help data collection more ethical. So I think one very focused question, but it opens up a lot. How do we actually change the practices that keep perpetuating some of these inbuilt disincentives? So over to you, Tina. And of course, Cecilia, you can come in as well after Tina.
Yeah, thanks for that question. This actually wasn't discussed at the executive board, but my take on it would be that we should give more contracts that are based on number of days, which is a different modality which also exists in the UN system. And it's typically done for more kind of staff-like functions, you know, that are performed on a daily basis or help ongoing programs. Whereas the specific individual consultancies typically are deliverable-based. And sometimes the number of days is grossly underestimated on those. So for 20 days that you get paid, you actually need to put in 40 days of work or so. It's a little bit the rules of the game. People who apply for those kinds of jobs know that that's how it is. So they inflate their daily rates to make up for the time lost in the, you know, what the actual level of effort is. But it's a kind of a weird system with many flaws. And I think perhaps paying people more on a daily basis as opposed to by deliverable could be a step in a direction to also allow more ethical practice and stopping when needed.
Thank you, Tina. I think there's a lot to unpack in that question, but I think a good start. And I think there's a follow-up to that. Okay, this is a bit of a conversation about consultancy basis. So maybe I'll just move on to see if Cecilia has a question. Sorry, colleagues, I'm not opening it up too much because I'm very conscious of time and that we have two other speakers. But maybe just this is a great conversation. Cecilia, do you want to come in? And then I can also look at some the comment that was made in response.
Yes, no, just a reaction to what Tina said. Obviously, we haven't discussed it, and I hope that this is also a beginning of a conversation in terms of what we learn from listening to so many different actors positioning the evaluation ecosystem, and is in particular the victims, so-called victims of evaluation. In terms of the contracting and the number of days, one thing that is clear, and everyone, it was as a common voice, is that when you want to work in a way that is inclusive, that is participatory, that is respectful, that is grounded in people's experiences, you need more time. You just cannot just do rush data collection, giving all the responsibility to one or two people that are entering into the communities without not understanding, knowing or anything, and then basically rush it because you have to deliver the deliverable. This was constantly mentioned as one of the main challenges to be ethical and to be inclusive and diverse. So I definitely think that the contracting modality is something that have to be changed, and that's why we talk about the organizational dimension and the policy dimension as a structural barrier. Because in the UN or any donor, those organizational decisions and policy are backed by policy decisions that are sustained at the board level. So how that is changed, I think, is very important, and the issue of giving enough time, including to reflect if it's necessary to stop at a certain point, is essential.
Thank you, Cecilia and Tina. And just to say that I think coming back to the point that was raised about the DEI within all of this, we need to really be opening up. And I thank you, Tina. You know, it's a transparency issue to table also the ways in which our organizations work, and you know, and how it affects the people. And I think I appreciate that point about the bargaining power being so unequal. But we're going to build on that. And I think we're going to have time at the end to come back in discussion. So before we do that, I'm going to pass on to Tarini and then Pradeep to also build on this discussion and looking at, you know, how do we flip the lens? How do we do build in operationally some of these reversals we want to see? So Tarini, over to you. I think you have 10 minutes as well. And then Pradeep, that's 10 minutes after you. So together 20 minutes, and I will be keeping time a little more strictly now, but over to you, Tarini.
Thank you, Ramya. So in keeping with our theme for today, towards greater inclusion and diversity in international development evaluation. So in my presentation, I'm going to focus on a few of our learnings from our work, which was especially during the COVID-19 pandemic, a time when we think the principles of leave no one behind, which even Tina spoke about, become particularly pertinent. So for the first time during COVID, vaccine equity became a global issue. And elimination of COVID required universal vaccination, reaching the last mile not only as an option, but also not even as a benevolent gesture, but there was a sense of urgency that came about. The last mile suddenly became, even though it was just for a short while, but it became a political issue. So as the world went into a complete lockdown and with a very short period of time and very little information given, it left millions stranded without work, shelter, or even the basic necessities. So the pandemic, we find, deepened long existing fault lines and exposed public apathy to people living on the margins. There were numerous research studies that reiterated its disproportionate impact on communities marginalized by social identity, sexual orientation, as well as occupation. And it is in this backdrop that we started this initiative called Collect, which is the community-led local claims and entitlements tracker. So this tracker had two aims. The first was to actually just gather information from the ground and to see what's happening on the ground and to kind of assess and evaluate the situation that was on the ground during COVID-19. And secondly, to strengthen community-led initiatives to sustain work at the grassroots level and to kind of revive collective action, especially during this time. So the exclusive target area of our initiative were hamlets and clusters within villages that are inhabited by scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, the denotified and nomadic tribes, Muslims, and of course, trans communities and non-binary communities as well. And within these groups, we were also focusing on those that were further marginalized because of age, gender, and disability. So by working with community-led local organizations and kind of involving fellows and volunteers that actually live within these marginalized communities, we were able to build an architecture with a base of about 70 researchers and about 560 community fellows, at that time all connected through telephones only. So when we think about the last mile from an international development perspective, the term last mile often is used to refer to place that is rural, often isolated, and it's often characterized by the absence of roads, communication, and the lack of infrastructure. And owing to these, people in these places are considered to be disconnected from valuable products and often seen as left in a perpetual state of poverty. But through our work, working with these communities during COVID, we recognize that this is often a very top-down gaze. And this gaze also leads to certain stereotypes that the community at the margins, for instance, that this community has low awareness, it's highly superstitious and believes in information without any rational understanding. However, especially during COVID, we felt we couldn't help but notice that this stereotype was also held true for everyone from the dominant castes and classes, especially during COVID, where these myths went around everywhere on WhatsApp. So while we look at the view from the last mile, when we turn it around and look at the view from their perspective, we found that there was now a community that needed to engage with a system that they had historically been discriminated against them, and often forcing them to retreat into spaces near each other, often leading to ghettoization. And the last mile often faces multiple last miles based on patriarchy, stigma, and indignity associated often with caste, gender, disability, and age. So when we analyze the situation further, we found that in the case of vaccinations, there were multiple miles being created. So in most localities, the first people to be vaccinated were those who had the privilege of seeing other people, often from other countries, and seeing their neighbors getting vaccinated. And a key point to this was that all of them knew that they had very good access to the healthcare system, knowing that if something were to happen to them, they would have access to the best healthcare, and it would be at their beck and call. So this, by design, we felt recreated a kind of a first mile that gradually then creates a last mile. So even within this first mile, for instance, the administration stated that they would first vaccinate frontline workers, which is the doctors and nurses. But however, within this front mile as well, we found that sanitation workers and morgue workers undeservedly were often left behind, therefore creating a last mile even within this first mile. And finally, there was the group that I mentioned earlier that often faces a dilemma. The system that had previously discriminated against them and remained accessible was now the same system that was delivering vaccines to them. So building on our learnings, we took an approach of trying to target the potential last mile first. So this included, as I mentioned earlier, involving a diverse set of communities, making sure that we work directly with these communities and across social identities, with all our volunteers and researchers being from these marginalized identities. Another aim of ours was to build hamlet collectives to take local action and kind of build accountability on the ground. By bringing this diverse group together, at that time only online, which included people from 11 different states, 70 different districts, we also aimed to kind of build solidarity at a macro level, kind of recognizing the challenges people were facing in different parts of the country. And owing to technology, all the researchers and volunteers also had the opportunity to actually attend sessions directly with doctors. We tried to make sure that communities had knowledge about COVID and what to do if side effects were to happen. So what we found is that through these questions that the community would put forth to doctors, it also helped understand the challenges being faced by the so-called last mile. And the interaction also helped create relevant and topical communication materials that were used in multiple languages across the country. So we find that often the common definition of the last mile suffers from a very top-down colonial gaze. And there are a few assumptions that are within this. Firstly, it assumes that the public-funded healthcare system could just pierce into the grassroots simply by addressing supply and demand issues of logistics and infrastructure. The assumption is that once those in the last mile have been provided with the information, the gap is closed. And secondly, borrowing from the common notion of the market being non-discriminatory, it's often assumed that market-based models could pierce into the last mile, especially now since households are being forced to pay from out of their pockets for healthcare in any case. So it's assumed that the market-based accountability system does not discriminate. And thirdly, it also assumes that philanthropy-based empathy could actually replace the dysfunctional accountability system of the public healthcare system. So this top-down gaze comes with a mythical understanding almost that its own world is non-patriarchal or non-racist, while the last mile is conservative and patriarchal. And it believes that its world is rational, while the people at the margins are not. So it's this colonial gaze that often fails to recognize that the persons manning all these models are often from the same class, same caste, and same gender identity that the last mile has to deal with. And just in context of this, there's another voice that the colonial gaze often fails to recognize, which are the analytical voices coming from the community, which are often by mediums of social movements or collectives that the community create, which are often ignored. And I think this is the part that Pradeep will now take over, so I will pause here. Thank you, Ramya.
Thank you so much, Tarini. You got so much food for thought. I'm like dying to get into the discussion, but Pradeep, straight on to you, and then we can come back to a discussion. And you also have 10 minutes, though Tarini was very economical, so she saved some time. So you have maybe about 11 minutes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tina and Cecilia, also for those presentation on the evaluation ecosystem that provided the context on presence and absence of equity approach and evaluation ecosystem. We often see the evaluators often strive to reach out for voices directly from the community, which often in Freirean sense are socially conditioned, unless evaluators are ready to engage with communities using various mapping tools to collect the articulated voices rather than just response to a top-down drafted questionnaire. And as Tarini indicated, research and evaluation community often ignores organized voices of margins in the form of various social movements and trade unions. They exist. Nevertheless, what is important is that more than evaluators, what we have seen in recent times is the grant makers are now showing keen interest on supporting social movements and collectives. While it is good that these collectives now have access to resources, the challenges are that these collectives may get projectized over the next few years. Some of the migrant movements whom we met in Southeast Asia helped us with historical transact of various examples how these collectives were NGOized in the early years of this century. It is in this context, as part of a program called Sindhanai, we reached out to a number of social movements in South Asia as well as in Southeast Asia to understand their challenges from the lens of grant making. In an interesting discussion, they said that often the monitoring and evaluation team from grant makers ask questions like, where are youth in your movement? Where is the second line? Why your board is not diverse? What is your sustainability plan? I think these questions, according to the collectives or movements, are also relevant, but they know that unlike an NGO, they cannot give salary and recruit some women or youth into their board or team. The struggle for social movement is not a monolithic struggle. It is inward as well as outward. Would grant makers have patience to bring the change? Therefore, some of these collectives felt that they need some kind of a self-diagnostic tool so that they talk to grant makers with confidence as well as with evidence. Today, I'm going to provide some examples of 4 tools which we were evolving. The first one is on theory of change. Here we met a group of organization, a group which is addressing the issue of anti-trafficking using the approach of localization and collectivization. The program is run by a team entirely belonging to the marginalized community, which Tarini was speaking about, the denotified and nomadic communities. They often face terms like log frame, theory of change, systemic shift, social transformation, structural change. These are so overwhelming for them. So they use so in order to help them understand some of these things, so we help them use some of the mapping tools of, for example, problem trees and solution trees to understand how trafficking solutions like rescue, ride, and rehabilitation are symptomatic solution and how collectives need to address root causes. So they sat together and identified certain root causes, which are often characterized in the form of patriarchy or casteist mindset or rapidly privatized and unaccountable essential service provisions as root causes. So the core reason why they felt the collectivization exists is not necessarily to focus on symptomatic issues, but to address the root causes. Now, in order to explain their engagement on root causes, we used an analogy of the game of chess. Not everyone has played chess, even in the community, but this analogy is quite something which we felt was very significant in explaining structure and social transformation. In chess, we all have coins or pieces such as queen, bishop, horse, elephant, which we have an analogy like organization and institution. Then we know that each of the piece has distinct rules in terms of their movement. These are like policies, laws, programs, schemes, and all. And then there is a board, and the board is the one which holds the coins, and we call the board as something like more like structure, which gives a base, and it also has a pattern. It has its own rules. So the anti-trafficking group tried to understand the piece or coins in terms of organization and institution they engage with. For example, the local police, local schools, Anganwadis, or the health centers, health clinics, on religious men as the chess pieces. And then they for each of these coins, they also try to identify the rules. For example, the laws, policies, which are related to this institution that they want to influence. Then they discussed about the board, and in board they saw patriarchy, which influences the coins as well as the rules. But they also tried to identify that there is not one board which is existing. One board is patriarchy, and another board is caste system. Morality is the third one, and the sex and porn industry as the fourth one. So for them as a collective, they want structural change, that is change in the board. And they feel that that the board of the Indian Constitution should replace these boards. So in that sense, they were able to find some destination in terms of how to engage with this structural change. But what was important was the fact that they are now able to explain the systemic shift through a list of actions against various institution rules and boards, which help them to evolve what we conventionally call log frame or theory of change. The second example is to inform how M&E team needs to understand the collectivization, not as a linear process, but as a spiral process. In our discussion with another group, which is Sanitation Workers Movement, it was interesting when they used Ambedkar's slogan as educate, agitate, and organize to explain all their activities. And then they explained how their activities at various stages make the mainstream panic. And the mainstream itself then starts engaging in educating, agitating, and organizing through its own formal institutions to often kill the movement. So the collective at any point of time is in its journey that's sometimes very dormant and sometimes resting. So like human beings, the collectives also sleep, take rest. So the group used the word indicator living collective rather than functional collective to explain some of their monitoring indicator. Similarly, the third example which I want to use is related to, often use of the term sustainability or exit strategy. These are often questions in the minds of evaluators as well. So with sanitation workers, again, we discuss this using the tool of what is called as participatory fund angiogram, like an angiogram where dye is used to identify blockades within the heart. In this, the collectives imagine the funds as dye and see how funds take different avatars within movement as honorarium or salary, or as travel support, or meeting support, or as documentation support, or as assets. So after mapping, the sanitation workers group discussed whether the collective owing to these resources will change its vision and mission, or would this create conflict within this movement. So for them, it is whether this fund is actually going to shift their focus was very key, and they, based on that, they evolved their own plan. I won't take much time. The last example is about ethics itself. So we know that the global north controls the funding as well as publication and academics. So they have often complete control over the evaluation ecosystem. So one area where their dominance is the least studied is on their control over ethics. Numerous evaluators submit their proposal for ethical clearance. And often the ethics of the IR Institutional Review Board sit in their mind, and they often dilute their proposal to get the clearance. So therefore, we thought that this is a very powerful entity which often is very invisible. So we have been facilitating community-led ethical review boards for last many years, almost a decade now. In one example with ex-child laborers, and we presented to them on how to evolve ethics around methods and even on compensation. They took more than a day to clear a proposal and yet had little consensus on many issues. We often wonder how numerous institutional review boards clear numerous proposals in no time. Let me conclude by saying that what is crucial is to actually mainstream some kind of the principle of contemplative thinking as a very integral part of any evaluation. It should be among evaluators, and the purpose of evaluation should also to promote or provoke contemplative thinking among the communities. It is time to claim evaluation from the vested interests who define even what vested interests mean, using certain terms like objectivity or neutrality or participation or even ethics. So there is a need to actually look at evaluation in a very comprehensive way, and we tried to do it in what Cecilia presented in the beginning, and we are happy that the LNOB helps us with an entry point in terms of pushing some of these structural shift which we need in evaluation. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And also thank you for being so economical, which means that we open up space for discussion. And I know the chat is a bit quiet, but I'm hoping you will come in. We're a small group, colleagues, so please feel free to engage and participate. And if, in fact, we have about 20 minutes more, which is a really great luxury to have, because we can really foster a good conversation. So I encourage you all to come in. If you really want to speak, please put that in the chat and say, I really want to come in and say something, because we do have that time. I mean, from my end, I just think, I don't know, between Tarini and Pradeep, I've so many things I wrote down. I mean, just things that trigger a change in the way you think. I mean, I just love multiple last miles. I think that is absolutely so correct. And we've all got boxed into certain kinds of language, where we just say this, and you talked about language, Pradeep, and there is so much jargon that one has people have stopped thinking about what they say means as well. We're just used to using labels to sort of signal something. But then those labels lose meaning after a point because they become bureaucratized and they don't stay alive. And I like this idea of a living, the kind of dynamics that Cecilia spoke to, but also the idea of living ecosystems, living languages, living collectives. And I think very often in evaluations, we're trying to kind of snapshot and cut something, but we don't really leave space to sort of do that preparatory work which locates us in something living, even if we have to do a snapshot to inform our thinking. And I think a last observation is just that, I often, I've been in environments with donors, and the donors are thinking about evaluations that can inform their publics, whether it's their citizens who are giving public investment, or who are interested. In one of the places I was at, the donor actually said, we have to use these very rigorous RCTs. We have to measure and say what our dollar is giving back, etc. But actually, he also acknowledged that his own publics, the publics of the country where he's from, are much more understanding than we give them credit for, and they want to understand as well what's going on, really. So I don't understand how, I think we have to think about why we have these evaluation practices that we say are like this, have to be like this, because they are about results and efficiency and effect, all of that. And so I think I like going back to Cecilia, your hand is up, that question about going beyond the effectiveness criteria we work with. What more do we want to see? So over to you, Cecilia. And please, colleagues, come in. I see something coming in. It's nice, but it's Sanjukta again, other colleagues, other friends, please come in. But of course, Sanjukta will get back to your point, maybe invite you to come in. So Cecilia.
Thank you, Ramya. Thank you, Pradeep and Tarini, for the presentation. I have two questions, maybe one comment to connect with our presentation at the beginning of the session, and then one question to Pradeep and Tarini. One is, as I mentioned in the presentation, when we did this South-South analysis, ecosystem analysis with Praxis and many others, the issue of how evaluation establish partnerships is central. And we see that normally the way of working of donors, or philanthropies, multilaterals, bilaterals, even I would like to ask Tina how is in the UN at the moment, they basically just work with consultants or individual evaluators who are portrayed as almost heroes that are going to undertake in a very lonely way this work. When what we found, and the example that Tarini and Pradeep are showing, is that if bilaterals and multilaterals and philanthropies partners with community organizations, social movements, local organizations that are proximate to the people that are being the target, so-called target of these policies, or that are being benefited or not by any programming, then that learning partnership with existing social movement, with existing organizations, with existing community networks and local NGOs is where you gain all this amazing amplification power that Pradeep and Tarini were showing that they achieve now, and even in the COVID when nobody was able to reach out. 70, hundreds of community citizens mobilized, collecting data, making the government accountable, voicing out what is necessary, what is working, what is not working in real time. But again and again, the way that the evaluation works is that they basically just work with rosters of individual consultants, and they perpetuate this elitism between some individual global South evaluators that also become a part of the industry that perpetrate this situation of exclusion. So our journeys of change and in the report basically are saying, if we really want to transform the evaluation ecosystem, also donors need to start thinking how to create this learning partnership with South-South networks and with Southern-led networks. And we are much better equipped and ready to be much more impactful at that level than one or two super expensive evaluators, even from the global south or the global north. Worse if they're from the global north and they are parachuted to our communities and our countries. But even, you know, a global south evaluator from Buenos Aires traveling to the indigenous communities in Tucumán, or that it doesn't work. So how also the recruitment process change, and I'm just asking Tina now, if she sees this is feasible as an entry point to transform to promote diversity, inclusion, and equity.
But Cecilia, may I just, before we go back to Tina, because I think these are great institutional questions, but I also want to bring in what Sanyukta was asking, where I'm sorry, Sanyukta, I don't know if you want to come in very quickly and we can hear your voice, but I think it's a very similar question to what Cecilia was saying, is how can we, you know, ethically work with communities? You know, what is that shift that's going to help us do that? So maybe you want to speak to your question briefly? Or if you want me to continue to read it out, I'm happy to do that. Please let me know. Okay, there's another message. Can't unmute. Okay. Oh, yeah, of course you can't. I'm sorry. We've kind of wrapped you up in a tight system of muting. But in the meantime, let me just say that we'll come back to that and hopefully unmute you. I don't know if I can. I am not sure of my powers here. I
have unmuted. Can you hear me now?
Yes, wonderful. Please go ahead.
Great, thanks.
And again, very briefly, but yeah, please.
Yeah, I'll be fast. Sorry, and thank you for unmuting. I just basically, yeah, it was going back to what you were explaining, Tarini. I mean, we go in with our assumptions of what we might think we know about marginalizations and things, but then as evaluators and as external to all communities, or those communities that we're working with or researching, we have our own power, relative power. So how do you know what you don't know, basically, and how can you do better as an evaluator and just make sure that you do it in an ethical way also, and not kind of make people more vulnerable, or yeah, just, you know, considering their privacy and data security and navigating those relationships in a respectful way. Sorry if I talked fast. I just wanted to quickly get that question out.
No, it's a great question, Sanyukta. And let me just go back to Tina, who Cecilia had also kind of reached out to, and then come back to Tarini and anyone else who wants to come in from the panel. So Tina?
Yeah, the question of who collects data, who analyzes data is really important, and it's something we all have to think about more. I really liked Pradeep's point about hearing the analytical voices in the community itself, and sadly, I would say that in international development evaluation, at least coming out of the central headquarter kind of evaluation offices, we don't do enough of that. We collect, and sometimes it's local people collecting, but the actual analysis of what this data means typically goes back one level or two levels up to the national evaluators or the international evaluators, or even the team sitting in HQ in a UN entity somewhere. Cecilia, I think from my experience, evaluation offices work in many different ways. Some routinely hire firms, so they commission out the entire evaluation to a firm, and then it would be up to that firm to subcontract a diverse team under them, and typically it's specified in the terms of reference what kind of markers of diversity are being sought. Is it you know, a north-south thing, a gender thing? Typically it's a mix of everything. And then there are other models, like in my office, where we hire individuals, but we also hire think tanks, universities, or institutions in the countries that we study. So in my own case, I've worked with the University of Bangui in the Central African Republic, with an evaluation association in Mongolia, and with a think tank, Southern Voice. So, you know, it's really a mix, and we have that capacity of giving various kinds of contract to institutions, to individuals. So, but I want to raise very quickly four points about that relate to my slide also that I presented earlier on kind of the context of how evaluations are being done, at least in my office in the UN system, and why that's so difficult for us to maneuver from an equity stance. So one is the breadth versus depth issue, right? It's about wanting to go into depth in the context that we look at, but at the same time, I sit in a central office. I have to do global level work, so I'm constantly struggling to do justice to the breadth question, while giving the depth, information to the executive board, because that's what they need to make decisions on. Another one is around time. I said that I have about 9 months to do one of those huge global pieces, and I would love to use participatory methods, but it's the first thing that goes, because I just cannot do it in an ethical way, right? I can't do it fully, so it's really difficult. And then on the conducting in-house, well, if I get consultant support, I'm guilty of this along with my colleagues. I think we tend to fall back on the individual consultants that we have already worked with, because we have no time, we have to do this quickly, we know how certain people work, and then we just hire them again. So this speaks to your point of, letting new people in, letting people in that know what they're talking about in context. And so there's this barrier there. And then lastly, I said this earlier, but I want to insist on this point, that, our messaging is sometimes really, well, what goes in the report in the end is meaningless, and really far removed from the people we collected information from, because it is aggregated up so many times and then shaped into recommendations for executive boards and the senior management of our institutions. And in a sense, we also need consultants that are able to do that aggregation work with us, right? And I'm not saying local people out of communities and social movements cannot do that, but I think it would take some training and partnership, like you said, Cecilia, a longer term engagement. So perhaps, engaging with a group for, I don't know, for 3 corporate evaluations or something, over time, and again, learning from them, but also sharing the way in which we need to work because of the framework we're in. And so having a longer term partnership there. Thank you.
Great. I think those were really helpful reflections, Tina. And I'm also thinking about, I mean, you're in the corporate evaluation space, but as a research institute, we're always, we're doing a lot of impact evaluations to learn and so on. And what you always find is you go in as if you're just coming in at a time, but actually what you need to understand is it's a process and a time, and you have to design it from the outset. Like what we often find is, even with NGOs, when we go in for evaluation, and we're very sympathetic to it, but that the way in which we collect knowledge and information, there are no systems for that, So when you often go in, there is, what do you work with? And I think that building up that conversation about how are people understanding things, understanding the communities you're working in, it has to go alongside, side by side, an evaluation timeline, because it's not that you can suddenly go in and say, well, I didn't find anything, you didn't look for it from the outset. So we actually also don't have an evaluation timeline, and I'm not talking just about the corporate ones, but any of them that's already anticipated in advance, well in advance, so those processes can be built up, right? So yeah, so I think we have a whole to change very fundamentally some of the thinking that we've been so used to doing. And we have a question perhaps to that, which is a little bit about what is your experience in advocating for participatory methods when it comes to, this is Lynn, of course, who is a colleague of mine, it comes to asking, for example, donors asking for participatory methods, but not being willing to let go of the control of the outcome and allocating more time. So of course, this is a question that, we all want all of this, but we're not willing to invest the time and the trust and the resources to make that happen. So Lynn wants to ask all of you, each of you, this question. So maybe, I don't know, it might be our last question, but Cecilia, Tina, let me start with Pradeep and then go backwards with Pradeep, then Tarini, then Tina and Cecilia. Pradeep, do you want to have a go at that question?
Yeah, I think it is a difficult question to answer because I think there is a very different understanding of participatory methods here in the ecosystem. participatory methods are often seen as, something like very qualitative. It is like more group discussions, getting into details about something which is not measurable, and bring them into the data set. And often it is restricted to use of participatory methods in only at the data collection stage, right? So in fact, I have reviewed a number of global proposals, and I feel that's the big challenge here, because for us, participatory methods start from the design itself. And as Tina was also saying, at the analysis itself. Rarely I have seen people advocating for participation of communities in designing the questionnaire, designing the methods, and designing the or analyzing and dissemination. And often it comes from the same mindset, which is that we often like innocent, so-called innocent voices of the communities, unarticulated, very raw voices. When it comes from community, we accept it. But when the voices come from an organized community voices, like a social movement or like a trade union, we see some vested interest in that. So we never help them get a space in decision-making of our processes, of our evaluation, because we feel that it will be a biased thing. So therefore, what is very much important here is it's not just doing 200, 300 FGDs and asking money from donors, and donors will just get into a trouble that why you are doing so much of participatory methods, etc. Instead of that, arguing for the participatory methods from the mindset of how to incorporate, how to challenge certain mainstream views, and how to bring views from margin from the beginning of your evaluation to the end. And therefore, even that will often be resisted by donors, not because they don't have resources, because they are often, as the pointed out, often afraid over the control over the outcome, right? So I feel these are two different things. And so I resonate with the question and experience, and just want to bring in the multiple pictures into it. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tarini.
Yeah, I think just building on that with a few also logistical aspects of, I think engaging with donors also, I think has now become another participatory approach that we take, also taking not just the journey with communities, with movements, but also the journey with donors, I think is something that Praxis has been doing for almost 26 years now. So I think that has also led to, although a really small change, but there is that conversation of participatory grant making, I think, which has now really taken over. And there are a lot of donors now coming to us to even talk about exactly this question and this idea and this how to do this. So I think there is a shift in the landscape that is happening, which I think is a very positive. I would at least like to think of this in a positive way, although this question, I completely, like Pradeep said, resonate with just the fact of how it usually works. But I wanted to also note that with participatory grant making coming in, there is a shift, and there are donors who are willing to take that journey with you. And many times that might happen at a later stage, where once you've done some of the work, they recognize the importance of having done this approach. So that's when they then actually say, okay, maybe do a few more and maybe we'll get more insights. So I think it's also that negotiation with donors, which is changing now. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Tarini. Great. Tina, and then Cecilia.
Yeah, thanks. I think I spoke already a little bit indirectly to this point. I think participatory methods from where I am sitting, so being a lead evaluator on one of those corporate evaluations, it's associated with a little bit of sense of loss of control, because by definition, I wouldn't be the one conducting this kind of work on the ground unless you go to my village in the northwest of Germany. But and then I have all this in my head, all these ethical concerns. So for instance, in the Leave No One Behind evaluation, where we had 5 country cases with participatory methods being used on the ground, but only for data collection, as I said. there was an issue around informed consent. So despite the ethics training that everybody got, still I was being sent, for instance, photos of people that hadn't consented to having their photos taken, right? And so me sitting at the central level and wanting to do an ethical piece of work, I'm getting palpitations thinking, oh my God, I wish I hadn't done it this way, you know, maybe this was a bad choice. But of course, I also wanted to say there are other ways in which participatory methods can be used also at institutional levels, not just at community level. So one thing we used for Leave No One Behind was a learning group inside UNDP. So something like a beefed up reference group, but where the communication was more two-sided. The evaluation team is learning from the people that participate in implementing or pushing the needle on Leave No One Behind in the organization. And those people also learn about evaluative thinking from us. So that is one way. Another one is doing Delphi surveys with advisory panels. So there are many, many ways in which we can have different layers of people that are somehow pushing for the same agenda, participate in an evaluation. It's not just at community level. And there's more we can do as those sitting in central offices in this regard.
Wonderful. And last word to Cecilia, because we're actually almost out of time. So Cecilia, over to you. And then I will say thank you.
Big responsibility. No, I was just going to say a reflection. I mean, as a collective of 8 Global South organizations that we have developed this very participatory bottom-up research with the funding from Foundation, we are now thinking how to influence change, because definitely, as Tina is describing, the bottlenecks, the fear of losing control, the mismatch between words and actions are at the donor, multilateral, bilateral, philanthropic levels, those who holds power. And at the end of the day, we are talking about power here. So the challenge is how we reflect as donors, as evaluators, as organizations trying to promote change, how we let go power, we share power in order to make evaluations more equitable, not just only more participatory, because participation is one aspect of equity and justice and dignity. So we are thinking about that. One thing that we are thinking of, besides disseminating the findings that we are doing on a voluntary basis, is providing accompaniment to the donors, because we know that they struggle every step of the way with very difficult questions and with a lot of resistance internally. And there is a need for them to have a critical friend to think how to open up a space at this moment, for example, innovating with something in terms of recruiting, or in terms of drafting the terms of reference, or in terms of engaging differently with a partner. So we are starting to have these one-to-one conversations in a more friendly way, and creating a self-assessment tool that donors can use themselves to assess, how they are moving from the principles to the action. It's very early stages. We're still looking for partners and for allies on that, but we hope that will be one way forward, besides all the knowledge sharing and advocacy that we are doing on the sidelines of our own paid work. So yeah, I think that accompaniment and that supporting in donors assessing and reflecting on their own practice for change is probably one entry point for us in the next few months.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. First of all, thank you to all the panelists. I think you've just very complemented each other beautifully and built, towards I think by the end, a very positive, we're in a positive moment, right? Where there is openness, there is interest, there is, as you were all saying, you're talking to people and people get this. It's not like it's sort of there may be resistance in some quarters, but on the whole, there are also a lot of allies. And the question is, how do we build on that positive by having these kinds of conversations, between also all of you are very diverse in terms of where you work and what you do. So I think it's a really positive way to end. But what I was reflecting was, it's not that you get to evaluation and you try and start doing all of these things. How do you build it in and bake it into the conversations from the beginning and build understanding of what kind of change you're trying to achieve? And it can't be while we're sitting in our offices and thinking about it. We have to already start transforming the practice of any kind of intervention that is eventually going to be evaluated, already start building in these principles. So I just want to thank you all. Yes, one step after the other. Where do you begin? You begin somewhere and then you take it forward. So absolutely right. And you guys are doing a great job of taking this forward. And we thank you. And thank you to the audience, also the participants here. A small group, but I think we had a very good discussion as a result with time, and appreciate it. So great. Thank you all, and bye for now. And hopefully we'll all be in touch in some way or another. So
thank you so much. Thank you,
bye.
Ramya, for the moderation.
Bye.
Amazing.
Yeah. Ciao.
Eso.
Bye.
Bye-bye.